Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into the misted harbors of northern Japan where, just past dawn, something impossible arrived. Unidentified vessel docks without crew. Read the local headline. It was barely picked up by national news. Just another quirk in a small coastal town, right? But the ship had no engine noise, no radio contact, no transponder code. It moved through dense fog and into Hachinohe Port without announcing itself, like a whisper threading through the stillness of early morning. And on the bow, barely legible under flakes of peeling gray paint, was a name: Yuurei Maru, ghost ship. The first to spot the vessel was a dock worker named E2. He had been sweeping near the southwest pier when he noticed the shape in the fog-silent drifting, not dragged by tug. No sound of motors. He assumed it was one of the smaller fishing boats that sometimes returned early from rough weather. But this one was far too large. He stepped closer and realized something was wrong. There were no running lights. The ship's hull was weathered with streaks of salt and rust, but not the ordinary kind. The pattern seemed deliberate, almost as if a shape had been eroded into its sides. The air around the ship felt thick, like mist and time were woven together. When authorities arrived, they brought a small boarding crew coast guard, a port official, and one man from the Maritime Safety Agency. The engine room was cold. The bridge? Abandoned. The navigation systems were powered off, but something unusual sat on the console: a folded map. It wasn't a modern GPS chart or satellite-aided layout. It was hand-drawn, lined in graphite, and stained with water. And in one corner, written in a calligraphy brush, Jauher Arshabanin, Showa 28, 1953. That was the first time the word ghost was whispered. Quietly, uneasily. The inspection team found no bodies, no signs of violence or looting. But the deck showed wet footprints, leading from one side of the bridge across the control room and stopping mid-stride at a sealed door. Even stranger, the food in the galley had not spoiled. A bowl of miso soup, half full, rested neatly beside a steel thermos. No mold, no stench. The team member who opened the lid said it still gave off faint warmth as if someone had stepped away just minutes before. The clocks across all rooms had stopped at the same time, 2:47 a.m. That alone wouldn't mean much, except the power was completely disconnected. There was no battery to drain, no internal system to fail. They ran the ship's name through registry databases. No record of a Yuurei Maru, not under that name, nor under common variants. The ship's ID plate, usually welded near the engine room or inscribed under the bridge floor, had been scratched out, leaving only a ghost of serial numbers that led nowhere. That's when they opened the radio compartment. The VHF receiver was ancient, possibly pre-70s, a model that hadn't been in service in decades. Yet the moment they touched it, it crackled to life. Just static at first. Then, a voice, soft, male, distorted by time or weather or distance, speaking not in modern Japanese, but in a regional dialect from Tohoku, one rarely used today. The words were simple. Hai, kore wa, ichi, maru, san. Yes, this is 1, 0, 3, then silence. Technicians later confirmed the radio had no active power source. The batteries had long since decayed. The panel's wiring was frayed and incomplete. The ghost of a signal, they called it. A final message playing on loop, or an attempt to answer. When news of the ship reached national channels, coverage was muted. Odd maritime events happen. Ships are abandoned all the time. But this one docked itself. It didn't crash. It didn't drift aimlessly. It aligned with the pier as if someone had steered it in. And if someone did, they were gone long before daylight touched the harbor. So now the question begins. Not just where the Yuurei Maru came from, but when, and more pressingly, why. Now, was it a returning memory, long forgotten? A remnant of some old loop still echoing into the present? Or had the sea simply decided to return something it once took? We're only at the start. When the Yuurei Maru docked, it didn't trigger any coastal surveillance alarms. This puzzled the Maritime Bureau. Every commercial port in Japan is embedded within a mesh of satellite-linked monitoring systems, radar, AIS, thermal imaging, sonar nodes in the deep harbor lanes. The system had no record of the ship's approach. It simply appeared within 500 meters of the Hachinohe Pier, undetected. Maritime Officer Arai described the data feed that morning. We ran the logs backwards. Nothing. Then forward there it was. Like it blinked into view. They rechecked AIS, Automatic Identification System, records. No trace. They used hull profile recognition software and entered the ship's dimensions and visible identifiers. Nothing. No ship named Yuurei Maru had ever been listed under Japanese registry, the International Maritime Organization, IMO, or even informal blacklists of suspicious or unlicensed vessels. It wasn't an oversight. It was as if the ship had no history. The lack of registry disturbed many port staff, but some saw a glimmer of logic. Yuurei means ghost in Japanese. Could it be a symbolic name? An artist's hoax? A rebranded decommissioned freighter? But those theories quickly fell apart. For one, the ship bore no structural modifications, no graffiti, no attempt at disguise. The hull showed layered oxidation and markings consistent with mid-20th century build practices, not a replica, not a film prop. The welding seams were older than most dock workers. The cargo holds were empty, but warnages rounded by long use, not recent scrubbing. There were salt patterns on the walls, thin and luminous under UV light. The kind that takes decades of ocean wind to leave behind. The ship wasn't pretending to be old. It was. Customs officers boarded with handheld radiation detectors, fearing it might be a derelict research ship carrying toxic materials or equipment. But the results showed no elevated readings, no fuel, no contaminants, just faint, ambient electrical static, unusual, but not immediately dangerous. One officer, Moriyama, walked the engine room with a handheld microphone to test acoustics. He later described the sensation this way. It was quiet, but not silent, like the air had memory. Every footstep echoed like it was happening twice. The closer you came to the core of the ship below decks, near the stern, the more off things felt, not in temperature or humidity, but in presence. Even the harbor animals sensed it. Seagulls, usually fearless around docked vessels, refused to land on its railings. Port Cat's residents of the fishing lanes kept distance. And for the first time in over a year, The nearby shallows showed no squid activity, as if the sea itself recoiled. Then came the matter of the ship's design. A naval architect from Aomori, brought in for expert consultation, made a stunning discovery. The layout of Yuurei Maru's hull, especially around the keel and bulkhead spacing, precisely matched the design specifications of a fishing trawler class built between 1954 by a defunct yard in Nagasaki. That ship, class model K-45 Shosen, was believed to have all been lost or scrapped by the early 1980s. And in a museum database, someone finally found a photo. Black and white, blurred at the edges. Taken from a beach north of Sendai. A ship in the distance, sailing away under heavy storm clouds, the name barely readable. But enhanced digitally, it became clear. Yuurei Maru. The photo was dated August 1953. Taken the day before a Category 5 typhoon slammed into the Sanriku coast. Among the many vessels lost at sea during that storm. Yuurei Maru was never officially declared because it had never been registered. How could a fully built trawler operate without state registry? Here, rumors began to reemerge. Of post-war vessels launched under pseudonyms, ships funded by private backers used for covert coastal transport or salvage of sunken wartime cargo. A gray fleet, ghostly by nature, never acknowledged in books or archives. Scholars call these Yuurei Maru unseen ships, ghosts not in the supernatural sense, but in bureaucratic shadow. And yet, the Yuurei Maru seemed more literal than that, because if it was lost in 1953, and if it has returned in 2024, then something has preserved it. Or, worse, something has called it back. If the exterior of the Yuurei Maru spoke in rust and shadow, the interior whispered with stillness a kind of suspended breath you could almost hear. Upon stepping inside, the first thing the investigators noticed wasn't damage or decay, but something much more disturbing. Order. There were no signs of panic. No overturned furniture. No splintered doors. Instead, the galley had a kettle neatly placed on a cold iron stove, a rice bowl half filled, and chopsticks laid across its rim with ceremonial precision. In the crew quarters, futons were rolled tightly and tucked under wooden bunks. The floor, dustless. Everything exactly in place as if time had stopped mid-motion. More unsettling still were the clocks. 3 were found on board, 1 on the bridge, 1 in the galley, and 1 beside the captain's bunk. All of them were mechanical wind-up clocks, consistent with mid-century maritime practice. And all 3 were stopped at the exact same time, 2:47 a.m. This detail alone might be dismissed as coincidental or due to simultaneous battery failure. But the devices had different manufacturers. One was made in Kobe, another in Osaka, and one imported from a Swiss maker common in post-war ships. No shared circuitry, no link between them. And yet, they froze together. A technician inspecting the bridge clock noted that the second hand didn't just stop it, was bent backwards, almost like it had resisted time itself before breaking. What could cause a mechanical spring to recoil like that, simultaneously, across different locations of the ship? The implication was chilling. Something didn't fail. Something interrupted. Ship logs were found, tucked neatly in the drawer beneath the navigation console. They were written in fountain pen, pages still crisp. The entry stopped abruptly on the 16th of August, 1953. The final words were, "Position unclear, visibility worsening. No reply from shoreline. Crew growing uneasy. Kuroshio current behaving strangely." Kuroshioth, black tide, one of the strongest ocean currents in the world. Often compared to the Gulf Stream, it flows northeast along Japan's coast, but the description of its behavior in the log was strange, as if the current had reversed or moved vertically rather than laterally. Such an event has no precedent in physical oceanography. In the captain's cabin, investigators found a photograph framed and placed with care on the shelf above the desk. It showed a group of 11 men posing on the deck of a ship, the same model as Yuurei Maru. One man stood slightly ahead of the rest older, dressed in white. The back of the photo bore an inscription, "For when we return, S. Kamimura, 1953. Attempts to identify S. Kamimura through historical seafaring records led nowhere. But here's what chilled everyone. When the photograph was exposed to UV light, another set of markings became visible. Across the bottom, in invisible ink faint, but unmistakable, were the words, "No moon, no wind. Time is folding." The ink used was identified as a rare magnesium-based invisible formula developed during wartime espionage training in the early 1940s. Why would a fisherman use it on a crew photo? And then, one more. Object arguably the strangest was found. In a locked compartment beneath the floorboards of the captain's quarters was a nautical almanac, sealed in a plastic wrap that had somehow kept it dry. It contained lunar data, star charts, and tide cycles standard fare. But wedged between the pages was a hand-drawn sketch. A compass rose, but skewed. The cardinal points were intact, NSEW. But between them were unfamiliar notations, not languages, not coordinates. Symbols that resembled waveforms, eclipses, and something like a spiral being pulled inward. One symbol was circled in red ink, and next to it, a phrase, "Return only when sea forgets." That phrase appears nowhere in folklore archives. No known maritime superstition records that exact saying. Yet, when shown the phrase, a retired sailor from Aomori aged 91 grew pale. He whispered, "We used to say something close to that. Ships don't return when they're lost. They return when the sea can't hold them anymore." A folkloric idea that the ocean can grieve, and in grief, release what it tried too long to keep. To many involved in the inspection, the Yuurei Maru didn't feel like a wreck. It felt like a rejection, as if the sea had finally expelled something it once consumed and we were now left to puzzle over what it was and why it returned now. Inside the wheelhouse of the Yuurei Maru, the analog radio sat like a fossil rusted around the dial, antenna bent, dials weathered to a dull sheen. It hadn't functioned in decades. Or rather, it shouldn't have. But when Officer Nakamoto leaned toward the console, a soft crackle rose out of silence. No one had touched it. There was no generator power, no external battery. And yet, it spoke, not clearly, not continuously. Just a faint rise of static-like wind in a deep forestand, then a flicker of words. The language was unmistakably Japanese, but the accent belonged to another era, slower, softer consonants. A dialect from the pre-war Tohoku region, used mainly in remote fishing villages and rarely heard now outside oral archives. Nakamoto called in an audio technician who brought a portable digital recorder. They replayed the sequence several times, slowing it, looping it, trying to isolate words from distortion. Then it came again. Shigur niwa materu. In the drizzle. We are waiting. A weather phrase. But strange poetic-like. An answer to a question no one had asked. The signal repeated, but never exactly the same. One time the word was shigur light rain. The next time, suyu, the seasonal mist. Always involving moisture, waiting, and some unseen presence. Over the course of an hour, 5 phrases emerged, interspersed by long stretches of static. The mist opens. The light is wrong. We are not ashore, but we are not adrift. Hold the current. The line breaks soon. Don't forget the moon. Awaiting replacement dawn. Each phrase evoked a sense of navigation, but not geographical temporal, as if the voice wasn't trying to describe where the ship was, but when. Audio specialists brought in from Sendai noted the peculiar frequency of the signal. It hovered not at typical maritime radio bands, but at an outdated civilian wave band no longer used since 1975. The equipment shouldn't even pick up that frequency, but it did. The real mystery deepened when engineers traced the radio's power flow using handheld current sensors. The circuit was dead, no juice, no movement of electrons. And yet, the transmission played only when someone was nearby, only in stillness. Never when the room was noisy or crowded. One researcher tried a controlled experiment. Leave the recorder on while the team vacated the deck entirely. For 30 full minutes, nothing. No sound. Then they returned, and within 2 minutes the signal flickered back. You are the link. That was the moment people stopped referring to the Yuurei Maru as a derelict. Not haunted, no, but responsive. A presence that required proximity, not to haunt, but to communicate, not with ghosts, but with memory itself. Theories began to swirl. Some believed the ship was trapped in a time-fold, its signal pulsing outward like sonar through layers of history, only responding when it felt familiar consciousness nearby. Others turned to quantum phenomena, suggesting that the radio, like certain particles in entangled states, could exhibit non-local behavior, activated by observation. A sort of maritime Schrodinger's cat, both silent and broadcasting, depending on who listened. And then came the anomaly no one could explain. A retired sailor from Yokosuka named Harada, visiting the port during its restricted phase, asked to hear the recording. When it played, he grew pale. That voice, he said, was my uncle's. He vanished with the Showa Maru in the typhoon of '53. The Showa Maru was a ship of the same class, lost in the same storm that supposedly claimed the Yuurei Maru. Harada remembered being a child when the family received notice. No remains, no wreckage, just absence. He claimed the voice on the recording used phrases only his uncle would say, personal idioms, uncommon syntax. The resemblance was too exact. Of course, memory plays tricks. Of course, the mind seeks patterns. But what unsettled the researchers was what happened next. Harada took a deep breath and spoke to the recorder softly. "Aniki, are you still there?" The radio, dormant for over an hour, flared once more. "We are still aboard. We were never pulled under. Not yet." The message came in clearer than any previous transmission, and then static. From that moment forward, the radio fell quiet again. No further phrases, no responses. Some believe it was closure. Others think it was the ship's last attempt to connect with the present. But one observer, a linguist from Kyoto University, made a more cryptic interpretation. She noticed that every message, every phrase when charted in sequence formed a linguistic arc, as if the ship was composing a poem, line by line. A maritime waka, she called it. A memory encoded in metaphor, stretching across decades, unable to be understood all at once. Not a warning, not a farewell, but an invitation to listen and to remember. On the morning of the 21st of April, 3 local fishermen were preparing to cast lines from a wooden pier just east of Hachinohe when they noticed something odd about the weather. It wasn't the fog northern Japan's coastlines are often blanketed in thick morning haze, but rather the wind, or the lack of it. One of the men, an elderly angler named Yuurei, said later, "The water was calm, too calm. You could drop a pin and hear it hit the sea." But what froze them in place was what came out of that stillness. A ship. Just a silhouette at first dark against the dense mist. It moved steadily, silently, its sails unfurled like pale wings against the sky. Except there was no wind. Not a ripple moved across the bay. The surface of the sea was mirror flat. Flags from nearby tugboats hung limp. But the ship advanced, steady as if gliding across glass, sails billowing gently in defiance of physics. The fishermen stood wordless as the vessel coasted past them, close enough to see the rivets on its rusted hull. One described it as like watching a painting come to life, then drift back into canvas. This wouldn't be strange in isolation. A trick of mist, perhaps. A hallucination in morning light. But 2 things anchored their testimony. First, their cell phones. One of the younger men, Tetsu, instinctively raised his phone to record. But the screen went black. Not dead blacked out. No buttons worked. The phone restarted on its own minutes later, with the clock showing the wrong date, the 17th of August, 1953 second. The ship they saw matched exactly the Yuurei Maru docked in the port that very day. Except this version had no dock lines, no resting posture. It was moving, alive in the water, sails tugging against a current no one could measure. When the men returned to land and heard of the Yuurei Maru's sudden appearance in Hachinohe Harbor, they were shaken. They hadn't seen it docked. They'd seen it sailing. But how could the same ship be moving off the coast and docked in the harbor at the same time? Marine physicist Takeda Misaki, brought in from Tokyo to investigate, suggested a concept that sent waves through the academic community. She called it a simultaneous echo, a term borrowed from early sonar systems, when a signal would bounce off multiple layers, and return a ghost image alongside the real one. If we apply that logic to time, she proposed, perhaps the ship is appearing in multiple coordinates because it is not fully here. To support her theory, she and her team placed pressure sensors on buoys throughout the harbor mouth. They were looking for any wave activity that might indicate a moving meson that should produce turbulence, or at least displacement. They found something stranger. Each time the Yuurei Maru's sighting occurred in the open water, the barometric pressure dipped slightly by 0.13 hectopascals within a 3-minute window. No seismic activity, no tide shift, but a localized atmospheric indentation, as if something massive had passed through without touching the water. This matched another report. A group of sea kayakers several kilometers down the coast experienced sudden temperature drops mid-paddle. It was like a shadow moved through the air, one woman said, and then it was gone. At this point, the question no longer seemed to be what the Yuurei Maru was, but how it chose to appear. Weather readings suggested the ship emerged during conditions of extreme atmospheric stillness. No wind, low pressure, mist-heavy air. In old maritime folklore, this was called Shizukesa no Shunkan, the moment of silence before forgetting. It was during such a moment that a retired shipwright named Kenichi stepped onto the Yuurei Maru dock. He claimed not to want answers. He just wanted to see the grain of her hull, the way you'd inspect an old friend's face. He placed his hand on the rail salt-flaked, sunburnt steeland, said it felt warmer than it should have. And then the wind returned. Not hard, just enough to lift the edge of a nearby canvas tarp. That's when Kenichi saw it. The sails, which hadn't moved all morning, began to pull ever so slightly against the mast, against the direction of the wind, not away from it, into it, as if the ship wasn't being carried by weather, but by something beneath, or within. Naval historians were baffled. No self-propelling mechanisms were found. No tugs reported moving her. No drift patterns explained her position. And yet, at 2:47 a.m. on the 22nd of April, a weather buoy 4 kilometers offshore recorded a low-frequency vibration lasting only 12 seconds, inaudible to human ears. The audio spectrum, when analyzed, resembled whale song, but metallic and modulated, a resonance unlike anything naturally occurring. Takeda said it best, "It's not wind that moves her, it's memory." By the 5th day of investigation, the Yuurei Maru had begun to attract quiet attention from groups beyond the maritime authorities. Not the press not yet, but discreet teams from Tokyo and Sapporo with technical instruments and unmarked vans. Some wore government badges, others didn't introduce themselves at all. But before they could unpack their theories, something changed on the ship. And it started with the rust. Inspector Natsume was the first to notice. He had taken a series of detailed photographs of the portside hull during his initial walkthrough, documenting every dent, weld scar, and corrosion cluster. 3 days later, he returned to measure sample areas for metal fatigue. But when he reviewed the photos on site, he frowned. "It's not the same," he whispered. The patches of flaked rust near the bow had smoothed over, not cleaned, not repainted, just less. The jagged orange crust was now a soft iron-brown blush, as if oxidation had reversed. He called over a naval corrosion specialist. Together they examined the affected area with a magnifying loupe. The surface was still old-pitted and weathered but younger than it should have been. That same evening, under portable UV lamps, a second anomaly emerged. Traces of old paint, the kind used in the 1950s, layered beneath the current dull gray, had become more visible. A bright indigo stripe along the hull began to shine faintly. The salt embedded in the metal seemed to recede, as though pulled inward. Then, 2 days later, it happened inside the ship. A panel of wood in the captain's quarters, once waterlogged and warped, had flattened. Its grain was richer, more saturated with color. The screws holding it in place showed less tarnish than before. Shipwright Kenichi, who had observed the original state, confirmed the change. "Wood doesn't undo itself," he said softly, "not after 70 years at sea." These changes weren't repairs. They weren't the work of human hands. They were restorations without origin. Some theorized a chemical anomaly, maybe something in the ship's steel-old alloys that reacted to specific air compositions. Others floated a biological idea, a kind of living metal harboring microbial colonies that slowed entropy. But no samples supported those ideas. Then, a university physicist offered something else. He pointed to a concept explored in certain speculative circles of cosmology: time asymmetry in localized systems. In rare environments, time might not flow evenly in all directions. He hypothesized that the ship, or part of it, was sitting inside a temporal loop that not only traps a moment, but tries to resolve it over and over again. The ship is healing, he proposed, because it's being reset. But reset to what? And by what measure? That's when another observer, a folklore researcher from Akita, noted something striking. In several regional tales from northern Japan, especially from fishing villages along the Chuguru Strait, there are stories of ships that are not ghosts, but ocean-held memories. Vessels that drift in and out of the world, bearing no dead, only unfinished hours. In one such story, a boat returns every 30 years to the same shore, never decayed, always empty. Each time it's slightly more intact than before, as if, slowly, the sea is letting go of what it once forgot to return. She recited an old line from a Hirosaki fishing song. To salt we give the broken hull, and salt returns the time we stole. Could the Yuurei Maru be such a memory? Not haunted by souls, but by an unclosed hour? At this point, even the most grounded officials began to treat the ship not as wreckage, but as something else. Something that didn't follow the laws of time or decay, maybe followed older ones we had long forgotten. The final piece of the puzzle came when a night shift observer set up a motion-triggered camera on deck. From 1:50 to 3 a.m., the footage was mostly still. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the camera captured something subtle, a faint shimmer across the steel handrails, a flicker, like heat rising, not visual distortion, but spatial warping, only a few centimeters wide. And for exactly 9 seconds, the time stamp glitched, recording the year as 1953 before correcting itself. The ship wasn't just returning. Parts of it had never left. It existed between layers across folds of time that sometimes aligned, sometimes frayed. And every time that alignment sharpened at 2, 47 a.m. the ship briefly recalled its truest form, not as wreckage, but as itself. And something somewhere was helping it remember. One morning, just after dawn, Lieutenant Morita, part of the archival inspection team, climbed aboard with a simple goal: to index any ship logs left behind. He'd done this work dozens of times across decommissioned vessels, recording names, duty rosters, supply manifests. But aboard the Yuurei Maru, the paper itself seemed resistant. He found what he was looking for tucked in a narrow drawer behind the navigator's desk. A battered crew logbook, bound in canvas and secured with a clasp so rusted it broke apart at his touch. The first few pages were routine departure notes, weather summaries, maintenance entries. But midway through the book, something changed. The ink grew lighter. Words became sparse. Sentences trailed off into white space, as if the writer had been interrupted mid-thought, over and over again. Then, most disturbing of all names began to vanish. Entries from early August 1953 listed crew names in crisp kanji, each followed by role and cabin assignment, 11 names in total. But on Morita's second pass through the same pages just minutes later, 2 of the names were gone, not scratched out, not torn away, just missing. The paper was clean, unmarred, as if the names had never been written. The surrounding ink remained unchanged, no water damage, no aging, just precise, unfilled lines where identities used to be. Perplexed, Morita made rubbings and took high-resolution scans. On digital review, something more chilling was revealed. The infrared filter showed phantom impressions, like faded handwriting barely burned into the paper's memory. For a moment, the names reappeared, Yamamoto H. and Kirishima T., but their ink could not be restored. It was like the page itself had forgotten them. This happened again 2 days later, with a second document, a meal rotation chart posted in the galley. Initial review showed a full list of crew meal slots, 3 shifts, 3 meals a day. But when officers returned to verify, the columns had subtly changed. 2 names that once appeared at the top, presumably senior staff, were now absent, not just omitted. The layout had reformatted itself, as if to close the gap. It was then that whispers of a word resurfaced among the older sailors, assisting with the investigation. Kage, Nin, shadow crew, a term used in post-war ports to refer to undocumented seafarers, often taken aboard for secret runs or to avoid taxes. These men existed in oral memory, but never in paper trails. And some believed they were cursed to never remain remembered. But the Yuurei Maru's situation seemed even stranger. It wasn't hiding these names. It was forgetting them in real time. Maritime historians offered another possibility linked to an obscure phenomenon called dynamic document erosion. Typically observed in high humidity environments, certain inks can degrade unevenly when combined with residual static charges. But here's the problem. The ink wasn't fading. The structure of the content was changing. Margins moved, spacing adjusted. Even the hand that wrote them seemed slightly altered across review. One cryptographer from Osaka brought a different lens. He noticed that the entries that didn't vanish were the ones written in slightly uneven script, possibly under stress, or written by different hands. As if the ship allowed only some memories to stay, perhaps the ones emotionally charged, emotionally anchored. He called this the grief threshold. Maybe the ship remembers what its crew could not bear to forget, he proposed, and it forgets what they surrendered too easily. Then came the most startling incident of all. A graduate student, helping digitize the logs, began to experience strange behavior in her scanner. Every time she tried to OCR, optical character recognition, the documents, her software failed, but only when analyzing names, dates, locations. Duties, those scanned fine, but crew names returned as unreadable null characters or gibberish strings of symbols. When she printed one page of jumbled data and brought it to her professor, he stared at the paper for a long time, then pulled an old maritime signal code book from the shelf. To his astonishment, the random strings formed a partial cipher-matching code phrases used during covert missions in the Sea of Japan from 1949 to 1954. One decoded message read, "Reassigning origin, host anchor unstable, memory must drift." It made no clear sense, and yet, taken alongside the vanishing names, the message seemed eerily deliberate, like something some presence tied to the Yuurei Maru actively managing its own record. Could the ship itself be protecting the identities of its crew? Not for secrecy, but as a defense mechanism from the outside world, or from its own unraveling? Or perhaps this was not protection at all. Perhaps the Yuurei Maru was simply obeying some older tide, a tide that slowly pulls identity out to sea, grain by grain, until only the shell remains, a shell of wood, metal, and silence. And whatever is still aboard, it began with a dream. One of the harbor's security guards, a quiet man in his 50s named reported it first. He had been working the 2 a.m. shift, stationed in a booth overlooking the dock where the Yuurei Maru was moored. For hours, he saw nothing move. No birds, no ripples, just the soft hum of the halogen floodlights reflecting on the vessel's silent frame. He nodded off for only a moment, or at least he thought it was a moment. In that dream, he was below deck, even though he had never set foot on the ship. The hallways were flooded with a dim golden light. There was a knocking, slow and rhythmic 4 beats, pause, 4 again, and someone unseen, whispering from behind a door that would not open. He woke suddenly, disoriented, cold sweat at his collar. The clock read 2:47 a.m. He shook it off, blamed it on fatigue. But the next night, it happened again, and this time he wasn't alone. By the end of the week, 7 dock workers and 2 local vendors had described strikingly similar dreams. All of them involved the ship. All of them placed the dreamers somewhere inside Itevan if they had never boarded. In every version, the setting varied slightly. A corridor, a galley, an engine room, but one element remained consistent. The sensation of being watched. Not threatened, not chased, just observed. Most unnerving was the detail of the eyes. "They were watching me from the mirror," said one worker, "but I couldn't see their reflection, only mine." Another described hearing a voice through the porthole glass, reciting numbers. 10305, waiting. A few brushed it off as stress, induced. After all, Strange stories make the mind more sensitive. But one of the investigators and assistant archivist named Emma kept a dream journal. She had been doing it for years. When she compared her entries from before and after the ship's arrival, a clear pattern emerged. Dreams involving the color greenish shade, not commonly found on the rusted ship, but prominent in old marine uniforms. The presence of salt in unusual places, hands, books, pillowcases, and recurring imagery of a door with no handle, always on the starboard side. Emmy, a methodical researcher by nature, suggested setting up an anonymous reporting system for all staff involved with the vessel. The idea wasn't taken seriously at first until the reports passed 10, then 15. All the dreams occurred between 2:30 and 3 a.m. All included the sensation of being inside the Yuurei Maru, and most contained one more strange detail. Water, but not flooding. Rather, water as sound. A dripping pipe, a distant splash, the creaking of submerged wood. Some even described it as hearing the sea from beneath, like being inside a shell of metal, listening to the ocean remembering itself. When the dreams reached over 20 accounts, researchers from Kyoto University's Department of Psycholinguistics joined the effort. They examined the dream descriptions and noticed that some used vocabulary uncommon to modern Japanese phrases that matched pre-1960s dialect, including maritime terms no longer taught in training academies. The question arose, how would civilians, or even young guards, unconsciously replicate obsolete seafarer language in dreams? One theory proposed empathic imprinting, the idea that repeated proximity to emotionally charged artifacts can create unconscious resonance in the brain's memory centers. But this usually requires physical contact, and most of the dreamers had never stepped aboard the ship. And then there was the cold. Several of the reporting individuals described waking up chilled, no matter the temperature of their homes. Some found condensation on their bedroom windows in the inside. One woman reported her pillowcase being faintly damp, with a slight, briny scent. Doctors attributed this to sleep paralysis episodes or psychosomatic suggestion. But the pattern persisted, spreading to others with no knowledge of the ship's details. The phenomenon now had a name: harbor dreams. Local media caught wind, but official statements denied any connection to the Yuurei Maru. But late one night, Emmy had a new dream. In it, she stood in the captain's quarters. The clock on the wall ticked alive, when read 2:46 a.m. There was no sound except for the faint whir of a phonograph playing a low waltz. On the desk, a book lay open. Not the logbook, not the cipher. A journal. She leaned in to read the first line. We are still at sea, but memory has docked without us. Then from behind her, a knock. 4 beats, pause, 4 again. She turned and woke up chilled, heart pounding, breath fogging the air. The next morning, she returned to the ship and stepped into the captain's quarters for the first time. And there, on the desk where no book had been previously recorded, lay a small leather-bound journal, water-stained, with an empty first page, except for one sentence, inked neatly in faded gray. We are still at sea, but memory has docked without us. When the leather-bound journal appeared on the captain's desk, it was as if the Yuurei Maru had shifted again subtly, but with intent. The ship no longer felt like a dormant artifact, but a vessel beginning to unfold its memory piece by piece, like a lotus blooming in saltwater time. The journal was delicate, but its cover was in tack-stitch corners, marine blue leather, aged evenly. There was no author's name, no title, just the same faint smell of brine and old cedar that now seemed to linger in all corners of the vessel. The first page bore the line Emmy saw in her dream. "We are still at sea, but memory has docked without us." She wasn't the only one who saw it. A member of the investigative team named Tanaka, who had dismissed the dream reports as harbor gossip, now stared at the entry, visibly shaken. The handwriting matched a sample from the crew manifest, dated 1953. Not closely. Exactly. They compared loops, stroke angles, pressure depths. The match was to one Seiji Kamimura, the captain of record, though even that fact was fuzzy, since his name was among those that had previously vanished from the logbook. Now it had resurfaced. It was as if the Yuurei Maru was reconstructing its own story, granting it back one thread at a time. The second page of the journal contained no writing, just a faint image, not drawn, impressed, like a leaf pressed in wax paper. It was a map, a spiral shape, hand-inked over a stylized sea, but the contours didn't match any modern navigation chart. In the center, the same unfamiliar symbol circled in red from the ship's earlier almanac. Beneath it, a phrase, "This is where time thins." Oceanographers from Tohoku University were shown the sketch. Though it defied scientific mapping, the shape roughly corresponded with an underwater trench off the southeastern coast of Hokkaido, an area known for geomagnetic anomalies and long the subject of regional myths. Fishermen called it Aokami no Sokonashi, the blue god's bottomless pit. It was said that boats traveling near the trench would sometimes drift in circles, even with working rudders. Compasses spun erratically. Radios fell silent. But it was the third page that caught the world's breath. A full-page drawing, rendered in charcoal and ink, showed the Yuurei Maru in a harbor, not at sea, but seemingly suspended in sky-colored water, surrounded by faint halos of light, stars overhead, shadows beneath. The hull appeared to be shedding, not breaking, but peeling, like skin revealing something beneath. Along the bottom edge of the drawing, a small line. "I do not know if we are lost or if the world around us has changed shape." After that, the entries began fragmented, poetic, journalistic. One by one, pieces of the crew's experience came to light. Each entry marked by date and time, but the dates began to repeat. The 15th of August, 1953. The 15th of August, 1953. The 15th of August, 1953. Over and over, in handwriting that slowly degraded, as if the act of writing had grown more difficult. In one passage, the captain wrote, "No sunrise. Only a dim blue smudge. We wait, but the radio catches no shore. The tide is no longer the tide." This idea of nature losing its meaning echoed in multiple entries. A crew member named Hiro wrote, "The sea listens. We whisper, and it hums back. I dream in waves. They show me places I've never seen. My mother was at the edge. She did not speak." Psychologists reviewing the journal argued these were signs of cabin fever hallucinations. but others weren't so sure. The syntax shifted with each entry. The tone ranged from ordinary to prophetic. One page seemed to write itself in reverse, starting at the bottom and spiraling inward. Another was covered in faint fingerprints made of saltiette. No one touched it with wet hands. Eventually, the writing stopped altogether. The last message was etched, not in ink, but scratched lightly into the leather on the back cover. We became unstuck. We are returning in pieces. Please remember us in sequence. After that, nothing. But from that moment on, the Yuurei Maru was no longer treated as an abandoned vessel. It was a memory engineer tide-locked witness to an event the world never saw, slowly revealing itself with each unspoken name, each drifting detail pulled back from some vast ocean of forgetting. And as the ship stirred gently in the port, no longer entirely still, one question rose with it. If memories can dock, can they also set sail again? They began calling it the hour. Every night, precisely at 2:47 a.m., the Yuurei Maru would undergo what researchers could only describe as a temporal chimera, subtle shift in space, air, and sound. It didn't shake. It didn't glow. It simply changed. People who stood near the ship during that moment began reporting sensory irregularities. A technician installing atmospheric monitors at the harbor edge claimed the surrounding soundscape collapsed to silence, a single wave, engine, gull, or breeze. Only his own breath, amplified as if heard from inside his chest rather than through his ears. A sleep researcher from Osaka, monitoring electromagnetic fields, described a sensation like falling upward, not vertigo. More like the air around her had momentarily stopped understanding gravity. At 2:47 a.m., the Yuurei Maru briefly ceased to behave like a ship. Thermal cameras recorded the entire vessel as one uniform temperature, regardless of sun exposure or shadow. That's impossible. Metal decks, shaded corridors, and open hulls all have distinct temperatures due to material and airflow. But the Yuurei Maru read, as a single living system every surface the same, every deck unified like skin under fever. Then came the internal movement. Sensors placed in the lower cargo hold detected micro-vibration pulses running along the ship's skeleton, but not from the outside. These weren't caused by wind or wave. They originated from within, like the slow heartbeat of something waking up, not biological, not seismic, just a slow rhythm. 3 pulses, then stillness. One curious detail was that this rhythm did not appear on instruments placed directly aboard the ship. Only sensors placed at a slight distance between 10 to 15 meters could detect the pulse, as if the ship's own body masked it, like a stealth echo. A structural engineer, Narita, made a chilling analogy. It's like the ship is vibrating just outside the edge of time, like it's not fully touching the present, but brushing against it. And every night, it taps in just for a moment to remind us it's still here. This theory was supported by an entirely different kind of evidence, a wristwatch. An antique Seiko, recovered from inside the crew quarters and placed on a lab table, began ticking on its own at 2:47 a.m. for the first time since it was found. Its battery was long dead. Its hands had been frozen for decades. But during that minute, the second hand twitched 5 clicks in rhythm with the unseen pulse. Then it stopped again. Investigators watched it happen over 3 consecutive nights. By the third night, even the skeptics had stopped debating whether something was happening. They were now arguing what kind of thing it was. Some believed the ship was part of a loop-closed circle of time repeating itself endlessly, and 2:47 a.m. marked the point at which the loop resynced with present reality. Others suggested that the ship was not a time traveler, but a beacon, something that receives rather than sends. A receiver for displaced memory, adrift until someone stood close enough to listen. A few fewer, but persistent, proposed an even stranger idea, that the Yuurei Maru was not just returning or remembering, but preparing to move again. Satellite imaging taken on the 28th of April revealed a faint change in water coloration around the dock. A series of spiral eddies, almost imperceptible, had begun forming tight clockwise swirls in the harbor's stillest corner. These eddies didn't match any known current pattern. They weren't caused by tides or passing ships. They simply began forming, each night, just before 2:47 a.m. and dissolving by 3 o'clock. It was during one of these hours that a diver testing sonar gear beneath the hull caught a single sonar reflection that startled him so much he dropped his equipment. It wasn't the ship's underside. It was another hull. A second echo, deeper, beneath the Yuurei Maru, a perfect reflection with no physical object to explain it. Sonar technicians confirmed it, a mirage of mass. Same size, same shape, but 10 meters below the ship, in water barely 12 meters deep, but there was nothing there. Not a shadow, not a blockage. Only this sonic memory, like a ghost double, hovering just beneath the reel. If it wasn't real, what was it? Narita offered one final thought. Every night, the ship wakes up. But maybe that's not the beginning. Maybe it's the other one, the one beneath, that starts first. And what we see above is just the ripple. What if we're not watching a ship appear? What if we're watching one rise? The theory of a second ship beneath the ship began as poetic speculation, but quickly gained traction when archival meteorological data was pulled from the day the Yuurei Maru first appeared in Hachinohe Harbor, the 17th of April, 2:47 a.m. A moment of total stillness. Barometric pressure dropped by just over 0.2 hectopascals. A sudden shift in the water's salinity was detected at sensor buoy number 7, located precisely 150 meters northeast of the dock. And then, perhaps most strangely, a rise in local seismic background noise, low-frequency oscillations not strong enough to be an earthquake, but indicative of movement beneath mass. These disturbances didn't align with any geological activity, but they did repeat in faint, precise cycles every subsequent night at the same hour. Marine geophysicist Dr. Hino from Tokyo Institute described it this way. If we measured the ocean like a sheet of glass, something very heavy, without actually displacing water as brushing the bottom surface, like a shadow dragging itself across memory. What complicated the analysis even more was a new discovery from a cable technician repairing data lines near the harbor. He claimed the fiber optic lines registered brief light distortion, small pulses of refracted signal that weren't caused by power surges or signal interference. It was as if, during 2:47 a.m., The light inside the cables had to bend ever so slightly to accommodate a spatial shift. Optical engineers reviewed the logs. It was true. The phenomenon resembled something seen in gravitational lensing, usually observed in deep space when the light from stars curves around massive objects like black holes. But here, it was happening in a fishing port in Japan, at the bottom of a boat. One scientist offered a metaphor. It's as if the ship is not entirely in our world. Its anchor is cast somewhere else and the chain is taut. The idea that the Yuurei Maru was physically bound to a counterpart, or perhaps a projection of itself from another layer of time or place, began to take hold. And then came the weather glitch. On the night of the 30th of April, a small typhoon front passing far offshore began throwing up light wind and chop toward the coastline. The harbor prepared for potential flood conditions, moving vessels further inland except the Yuurei Maru, which could not be towed. But curiously, during the peak of the winds, while flags snapped and the harbor stirred, the area immediately around the Yuurei Maru remained perfectly still. Witnesses described it as a dome of silence, like a snow globe untouched by the storm. The water around the ship held its linoleau ripples, no motion, no splash. Debris floated right up to it, then drifted away. A sailor watching from the dock said, "It's like the wind forgot it was supposed to touch the ship." This caught the attention of a climatologist named Sakurai, who reviewed live drone footage of the event. Using heat mapping filters, she discovered a startling shape, an elliptical field around the vessel, roughly 35 meters in diameter, slightly oval, and roughly 10 degrees cooler than the surrounding water. She cross-referenced this with previous nights and found a pattern. The shape was always there. It was just more visible in contrast during active weather. But it wasn't always the same size. It grew slightly every night. By May 1st, the field extended nearly 60 meters. Now the working theory shifted again. What if the Yuurei Maru wasn't just appearing? What if it was expanding? Not spatially, not just in area, but in influence, drawing nearby time and memory into itself, creating a slow bloom of altered perception, one ripple at a time. And perhaps, just perhaps, the ship beneath the ship wasn't its twin or echo, but its future self, or its origin, or its destination. A vessel rising upward through history, scraping against each layer of reality like a whale, surfacing through ice each, night coming closer, louder, heavier. A diver named Hane put it most hauntingly after surfacing from a sonar pass near the bow. "It's not that the Yuurei Maru is back," she whispered. "It's that it was never gone. We just weren't in the right part of the dream to see it." By the first week of May, the Yuurei Maru was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a phenomenon that transcended disciplines. Naval engineers, physicists, historians, spiritualists, linguists, even sleep researchers now huddled around its gangways, notebooks in hand, watching, waiting, and listening. But perhaps no shift was more startling than what happened inside the ship. At exactly 2:47 a.m. on May 3rd, the vessel emitted a tone, not a mechanical noise, not metal groaning or a natural creak, but a clear harmonic resonance, low and continuous, lasting 11 seconds. It was faint. Most didn't hear it directly, But handheld recorders captured it. A single, sustained note just below human vocal range, with a gentle tremble almost like a tuning fork suspended in water. Afterward, the inside of the ship began to change. The main corridor, once tight with rust and shadow, now gave off a faint scent cedarwood, layered with salt, not artificial, not from any cleaning agent. It was the unmistakable smell of fresh shipbuilding materials, as if the wood had recently been sanded and oiled. And then came the doors. 6 of them, located across the lower deck bulkheads, had remained sealed since the Yuurei Maru's arrival. Hinges fused, latches jammed. None had been forced open for fear of damage. But that morning, one of them stood ajar. No one saw it open. There were no sounds, no alarms. But the heavy steel door to the radio compartment, once fused with corrosion, now swung with a smooth, frictionless ease like it had just been greased. Inside, the air was warm. Too warm. A thermographic camera clocked it at 19.3 degrees Celsius, several degrees higher than the rest of the ship. The walls, layered in peeling maps and analog equipment, were dry, dustless, not freshly cleaned, but untouched by time. The log sheet inside the room tied to the wall by string had no aging at all. It looked like it had been written yesterday. The entry read, "Com check, 0140. Interference persists. Unable to isolate source. Confirmed drift path remains stable. Awaiting contact. Coordinates pending realignment." The handwriting once again matched previous samples from Captain Kamimura. But the ink was different, darker, smoother, as though written with a pen that hadn't aged 70 years. The page itself smelled faintly of sea algae. At the bottom of the page was a set of coordinates. They did not match any known shipping lane, but they did form a pattern, a loop. Plotted on a maritime chart, the coordinates described an inverted spiral, ending precisely where the Yuurei Maru had first docked in Hachinohe. In other words, the ship had predicted or pre-recorded its arrival. The document was dated the 13th of August, 1953. And suddenly, the idea of prophecy wasn't a metaphor anymore. At this point, an independent linguist named Midori Ueshiba joined the team. Her specialty was lost dialects and semantic drift, the way meaning changes over time. She focused on the phrase, "awaiting contact," repeated in multiple logs. Was the ship attempting to reach someone or something? One theory emerged. The Yuurei Maru was navigating not by stars or compasses, but by consciousness surfacing only when it encountered the right minds, the right emotions, the right presence. Supporting this were the dream echoes that had continued to spread. Several children whose homes overlooked the harbor began talking about the house in the water. Not a boat, a house. One girl, age 6, said, "I saw my grandfather there. He wasn't old anymore. He had no shoes." When asked what he said to her, she replied, "He said they don't sail anymore. They just remember the way." Researchers asked her to draw what she saw. She drew a hallway lined with lanterns and a rope ladder leading upward, not to a mast, but to the moon. No one could explain it. But 2 days later, in the early hours of May 5th, a crew member who had been documenting internal temperatures returned to the same radio room. Everything was as it had been unchanged, except the log sheet on the wall had a new line, written in the same hand. "You are near enough now. Please bring the key." No one knew what the key referred to. There was no key found on board, no references in other documents, no obvious symbolism. But the idea took root that perhaps the Yuurei Maru cannot fully return or fully vanish until a specific event occurs. A convergence, a final memory, a signal answered. That night, as the team debated the meaning, the ship's lights flickered, and a new harmonic note sounded this one higher. Brighter, 5 seconds, then silence, as if the ship had heard their questions and was still waiting for the right one to be asked. By now, people had stopped calling it a ghost ship. It wasn't haunted not in the traditional sense. It wasn't even abandoned. The Yuurei Maru felt increasingly like something in mid-sentence, partway through a story that never quite ended, but also never began. It occupied a space between conclusion and origina living pause, and then it started answering. The first reply came via radio. A shortwave enthusiast named Fumiko, based in Chiba, had been scanning open maritime bands nightly. On May 6th, at exactly 2:47 a.m., she picked up a faint transmission on 4,872 kilohertz of frequency, no longer used for commercial or emergency operations. The signal was steady, though cracked with static, and then came a voice, male, measured, calm. Commencing cycle, the 14th of August. Object stable. Drift perimeter holds. Manifest reduced. Remaining 6. Continue oscillation. Signal may breach if aligned. Await threshold. Fumiko didn't recognize the voice, but she recorded the full transmission and submitted it to maritime authorities. The voice matched phonetic characteristics of 1950s, Japanese military broadcast standards addiction style, no longer taught or commonly heard. Experts confirmed the cadence was natural, not synthesized. A team cross-referenced the voice with recovered archival interviews from the post-war maritime fleet, a 1,952 voice print of Captain Seiji Kamimura, matched with 97% certainty. This was the same voice recorded live from a ship docked, silent, and empty. 2 nights later, the message changed. Displacement confirmed. Structural convergence increasing. We require location of key. Host anchor. Weakening. The phrase host anchor began to appear in all internal documentation after that. No one could define it precisely, but it became shorthand for whatever was keeping the Yuurei Maru tethered here, whether physically or conceptually. The working hypothesis shifted again. Maybe the ship was trying to return somewhere, or somewhen, but not as a whole. It was fragmented, shifting in layers, and until the right anchor was resolved emotional, temporal, symbolicit would remain here, gathering pieces of its former self like scattered reflections drawn back to a mirror. That night, a marine physicist named Dr. Koizumi walked the deck alone. She had reviewed every signal, every pressure reading, every sonar hiccup. She had come from science, but now she walked barefoot across the steel floors and admitted aloud to no one, "I think it's not looking for a place. I think it's looking for a moment. A moment where something went wrong, where time fractured, where 6 crew members remained and never came home. She returned to the radio room, sat quietly, and placed an old photograph on the desk. It showed a group of 11 sailors, smiling, resting on crates, in the sun, somewhere at port. It had been recovered from a family archive in Sasebo. 6 of those faces were circled. That photo had not been there the day before, but now it lay beside the journal. Later that night, the ship responded again. This time, not with words, but sound. The entire hull emitted a low-frequency pulsonate, a tone, but a pattern. 3 short pulses, a pause, then one long, sustained vibration that resonated through the dock like a muted chime. It lasted precisely 47 seconds. When acoustic engineers mapped the waveform, the signal resembled something strange. A Morse code-shaped echo, but mirrored, like reading a memory backwards. The translation? Anchor fading, memory thinning, last drift imminent. 1 night left. And indeed, the following evening, something new occurred. At 2:47 a.m., as researchers watched with equipment primed, the ship's port lantern lit on its own. It cast a pale blue-white glow-nothing like modern LEDs. The light was soft, filtered, as if seen through water. Then, on the starboard side, a door that had never opened before creaked wide. Inside was a single chair, a folded blanket, and an empty mug. No dust, no mold. The air smelled faintly of tea and diesel. There was no logbook inside, only a small wooden plaque hanging from the ceiling. It read, "For the last to wait. May they not wait alone." As the team stood frozen outside the room, the clock ticked 2:48. The lantern dimmed. The door slowly closed itself. And just like that, the hour was over. The next day, the ship was different. No new noises, no new documents, no signals, but something had shifted not in structure, but in presence. The crew monitoring the Yuurei Maru described the change with different words. Calmer, more distant, quieter not in sound, but in feeling. It was as though the ship had exhaled. Marine researchers noted subtle changes in the water. The eddies that had previously spiraled around the hull had vanished. The surrounding air temperature, which had consistently dipped during the nightly hour, now held steady. Thermal cameras showed no variation. The infrared bloom was gone, and for the first time in weeks, the Yuurei Maru did not shimmer at 2:47 a.m. The moment passed without light, without vibration, without sound. Instead, just before 3 a.m., something else happened. A bird landed on the ship's rail, a small seabird, perhaps a ternlight, white and quick. It perched briefly, looked around, and then flew off again. But in all the days since the ship's arrival, no living creature had touched it. Not a single bird, not even an insect, had dared. And now one had. That single act stirred a different kind of speculation, subtle but heavy. Had something departed, or had something finally come home? At 8 o'clock that morning, Emmy, the archivist who had dreamt of the journal weeks earlier, found herself drawn back to the captain's quarters. It was quiet. Still, she touched the corner of the desk, then looked down. The leather-bound journal was gone. In its place sat a photograph, faded but dry. It showed the Yuurei Maru at sea, its sails bright with sun, its crew waving from the deck. There were no dates, no markings, but on the back, someone had written a single word: complete. The researchers held a final review meeting that evening. The consensus was fragile, cautious. Some believed the ship had resolved its last memory, aligned its anchor, and now rested either fully here or finally free to move beyond us. Others weren't so sure. Dr. Koizumi, who had walked the decks barefoot and spoken softly to the vessel, held a different opinion. "It may not be over," she said. "It may simply not need us anymore." Forensic analysts ran one last sweep of the ship. Every door was now unlocked. The radio room was dark, the logbook gone, the photographs filed. The name plates, once corroded beyond legibility, had reformed just enough to show initials, 6 names, not 11. The missing 5 had returned to the unknown, but the 6 were remembered. And that seemed to matter. In one final act, harbor officials decided to leave the ship untouched. No dismantling, no towing, no tourist signage. The Yuurei Maru was moored with a simple plaque nearby. No entry. Memory under observation. Since then, there have been no more nightly pulses, no dreams reported, no tonal anomalies. The ship now rests in gentle silence, absorbing the sun by day, glowing faintly under the harbor lights by night. But sometimes, just sometimes, around 2:47 a.m., longshoremen say the light glances off the rail just right, and for a second you can see a shadow pass along the bridge. Someone in uniform, hand resting on the wheel, looking out not at the harbor, but beyond it, as if charting a course, one last time. By mid-May, the story of the Yuurei Maru had begun to fade from headlines. News outlets, once camped daily along the edge of Hachinohe Harbor, folded up their tripods. Researchers packed their cases. The nightly reports stopped. The graphs went quiet. The ship, now still and unchanging, had seemingly slipped back into silence. But for those who'd lived closest to it, who stood on the docks night after night, who walked its decks, or sat in its ghost-lit rooms, something remained. The Yuurei Maru had imprinted itself. Not like trauma, not like legend, more like a sentence whispered so softly, it writes itself in your memory anyway. What do we do with a story that never finishes? A ship that might still be listening? Emmy, the archivist, kept returning. Not every day, just sometimes, when the air smelled like rain and sea iron. She would sit on the bench near the dock, journal in her lap, eyes on the vessel. She began to notice something unusual: visitors. Not tourists, not scientists. Elderly men and women, alone, quietly dressed, carrying small things, flowers, letters, old gloves. One brought a harmonica, another a teacup wrapped in cloth. They didn't talk to each other. They didn't ask questions. They simply stood at the edge of the dock, faced the ship, and placed their objects down like offerings. A small porcelain dog, a folded origami crane, a photo torn in half, tucked under a stone. They would linger a few minutes, sometimes longer, and then walk away. When Emmy finally approached one woman, perhaps in her 80s, and gently asked if she knew the ship. The woman replied, "Number. But my brother left for sea in 1953, and I think this one knows where he went." It was hard to argue. The Yuurei Maru had become a receiving vessel not just for its own story, but for all the lost ones, for every sailor never returned, every family without a goodbye, every logbook closed too early. Some scholars began to write about it as a liminal objectaship that had passed through memory in such a specific way. It now functioned like a tuning fork for grief. Others called it an oceanic mausoleum, but locals gave it a simpler name, the Watcher. Not a ghost, not a god, just a ship who stayed long enough to remember who it once was. And because of that, it made space for others to do the same. At night, with the docks quiet and the tide low, a few lanterns still flicker from its cabin windows. No electricity, no battery, just a pale glow. Some say it's reflection, others say it's memory. A few believe it's neither. But whatever it is, it doesn't ask anything of you. It doesn't want to frighten or convince. It just waits, softly, patiently, like something that has seen too much to speak, and now prefers to simply listen. So, if you ever find yourself near Hachinohe at night, take a slow walk down to the harbor. Bring something small if you like, a name, a story, a silence, and at 2:47 a.m., if the air feels still and the water just barely sighs beneath your feet, you'll know the Yuurei Maru is awake, and it remembers. And now, traveler, you've walked the decks. You've breathed the salt air. You've stood beside the unspoken. And you've listened quietly to the way memory drifts like fog over water. Your eyes may be heavy now. Let them rest. The echoes of the ship are gentle tonight. No more pulses, no more questions. Just a long, silent tether between you and something older than time. Let yourself drift. Let the tide pull you softly into sleep. For tonight you are remembered, and the waves, they are still listening.